All right, in this lesson, we're going to go over some items that can be considered evidence for evolution. You should have some guided notes printed off and a pencil ready to take some notes. All right, so according to most scientists, all living organisms share a common ancestor. So the theory is that we all come from one common ancestor, and that over time we've moved into different environments and have adapted to those environments or moved on to other environments, and that those changes that happen as a result of moving into those environments results in evolution. And this is defined as change in organisms' traits over long periods of time. Okay, and this is thought to explain the diversity of life forms. So it explains why we have trees and lobsters and T-Rexes that are no longer around, but then we also have horses and human beings and dragonflies. Okay, so in this lesson we'll be talking about what evidence is there for evolution. In what way, what are we looking for when we try to find evidence for a common ancestor? Okay, so a lot of these have to do with similarities across species, across organisms. And one of these structures is called a homologous structure. Homologous means similar, right? A similar structure. And this is a trait, right? A feature, a characteristic, or a structure that is similar to those of another organism. This indicates common ancestry. This trait may have changed over time if that change provided an advantage for survival or reproduction. Okay, if an organism is going to live and continue to pass on its DNA to future generations, it first of all has to survive, and then it has to reproduce. Okay, these are two main ideas in natural selection and evolution. You have to be able to survive, and you have to be able to reproduce. You have to be able to have babies. And if you are unable to do one or the other of those, then your DNA is not going to make it into the next generation. So whether these traits are advantageous, whether they're good or bad for survival or reproduction, is going to depend on the environment. Okay, we'll look at a few different examples of that later on in the semester. But some examples of a homologous structure might be body parts that have the same anatomical composition, right, the same anatomy or structural features. Now, scientists look for these homologies or these similarities as part of the evidence for evolution. So let's take a look at these. These are considered homologous structures. Okay, so if you look at them, take a few seconds to look at these, a few minutes maybe. We have the human arm, a bat wing, frog arm, a porpoise flipper, and a horse. Oops, a horse's hoof. Now, all of these function very differently, right? The horse is on all fours, and these are used to gallop. The porpoise can use its fins to help it with swimming. Frogs can use it on land and in the water. Bats fly, and humans use their arms for all sorts of different things. But they all share homologous structures, and that is the lineup of their bones goes from the humerus. Okay, each of these is the humerus, and next we have the radius and the ulna. Okay, these are also shared in the different organisms. Right, we go from one humerus to two bones here, the radius and the ulna, and then our hands, or the bat wings, or the porpoise fins, end up with a lot of different bones in the hands or the hoof. Okay, so we see these patterns, these repeating patterns in the arms and wings and legs and flippers, and we say, oh, this looks like they have a common ancestor. They don't share the same function, but over time, they do have the same structure, and over time that function has changed. Another example of a homologous structure would be the teeth in a saber-toothed tiger. Okay, so these were a top predator around 10,000 years ago, but as the environment changed, they became extinct. So the saber-toothed tiger, as we know it, did not survive. It stopped surviving, it stopped reproducing. But the modern lion is something that evolved from the saber-toothed tiger, and one of its traits that remained in the DNA were these teeth. Okay, so if you look at modern day lions, they still have these very large front teeth, and those are considered to be homologous structures. Vestigial structures are also evidence of shared ancestry. Okay, so computer here. These are anatomical structures that still exist in an organism but no longer serve a function. This is one example of this is the tailbone in a human that is thought to have evolved from an actual tailbone in a primate relative. So that is what we call a vestigial structure. So something that still exists in an organism, but it no longer serves that function. It's just kind of left over. It's not harming anything. It's not helping anything. It's just still there. So here's another example of a vestigial structure. In snakes, if you look at the anatomy of a snake, it actually has a pelvis and a femur. How crazy is that? Okay, so these femurs and the pelvis. Snakes don't really have a use for hips, but they still have a pelvis because they evolved from something that did have hips. Okay, so if you look on the outside surface of this snake, you'll see that there are some reduced hind legs. Okay, this is a vestigial structure. It no longer serves a purpose, but it is still in the anatomy. It's still part of the snake's DNA to make these reduced hind legs. Here's a vestigial pelvic bone in whales. Right? Whales used to have legs, as we learned about in class, and the legs were attached to the pelvis, the hip bones. Right? So this is a vestigial structure, and if you look at modern day whales, they still have a pelvic bone. That is evidence that they have evolved from something else over millions and millions of years. Okay, so if we look at, I'm constantly in the way here, another form of evidence that we take to indicate a common ancestor, or another form of evidence of evolution, is what we call embryology, and the study of embryos. So if we look at the embryos, right, these are very young fertilized eggs. Okay, they've started developing into the organism, but the fish, salamander, tortoise, chick, pig, calf, rabbit, and humans all start off looking very similar to each other. Right? There's an eye, there's a tail structure, there's a heart, right? We have these heart. So they all started from one fertilized egg and developed in different ways to form a fish, right? Oops. Salamander will actually have legs, turtles will have shells, and so on and so forth. Here's a human, right? Over time, they develop different features, and the size of the brain is different, the size of the legs and the tail is reduced in quite a few of these, but they have similarities, and this is thought to indicate that they all have a common ancestor. One other form of evidence for evolution is a comparison of DNA sequences. Now, DNA sequences are a lot like a recipe for proteins. Okay, now we learned in the macromolecule unit that our proteins are needed for pretty much doing everything in life, right? And our DNA is the recipe card that says this is how you need to make this protein. Okay, so if we look at the DNA, so the recipe cards for these different proteins in a kangaroo and human, bullfrog, and wheat, right? 4 different kingdoms here. Not completely. Well, animals and then a plant kingdom. So just two kingdoms. The amino acid is kind of a unit of the recipe card. Okay, so the kangaroo and humans and bullfrogs would all have proline as their first amino acid, which is dictated by the DNA. Okay, wheat already has alanine instead of proline. Okay, so if we look at the sequences of DNA and the sequences of amino acids that make up proteins, we'll see a lot of similarities between organisms, and we'll also see some differences. But we have a lot of these similarities in the order of the amino acids and how the recipe is written up. Also is thought to indicate common ancestry. So our DNA dictates which amino acids make up the proteins, and the proteins determine the traits. So one thing we need to clarify here is that analogous structures seem like they might be very similar to homologous structures, but these are not evidence for evolution. Let me see if I can explain this. So analogous structures are structures that have a similar function in unrelated organisms. These are not evidence for evolution, as I said. These structures are similar because they evolved to do the same job or function, but they do not show evidence that they were inherited from a common ancestor. Again, an example is probably the best way to teach about this. An example of an analogous structure would be a bird wing and a dragonfly wing. Both of these are used to fly. They actually look similar and they function very similarly, but these are made up of feathers and bones, and these are made up of chitin and exoskeleton material. So these are not from a common ancestor. Okay, same idea here. Here are the bird wings and wings of an insect are made of different materials. Okay, so different proteins would be required to make both of these. So these are not showing a common ancestor. These are analogous. Okay, same function, but different ways that they came about this. Okay, so some other questions to consider as we go through this unit are, how do organisms change over time? We talk about, the theropods turning into something like an Archaeopteryx and then evolving to modern day birds, but how exactly did that happen? So we'll talk about that. And why do organisms change over time? What kind of factors in the environment or in nature are pressuring those organisms to change? And what drives the evolution of traits to happen? Okay, so we'll continue to talk about those throughout the unit.